And when I realised that was happening, I thought, well, the British must know the answer to these questions then. So I did a FOI, Freedom of Information request, to HMRC, the tax authority, which happens to be based in Newcastle, and they said, we don't know. So I nagged them and said, you must know. And then eventually they said, actually, sorry, we were wrong there. We do know. I said, great, tell us then. And they said, but we've decided we can't tell you. It's too secret, this information. It's necessary for government discussions that this isn't generally known. And I thought, hold on, this is collected at taxpayers' expense, and you ought to tell us. But then I found one very nice individual in Newcastle who said, well, I know we can't tell you, but by the way, this information is available on an obscure website, on the obscure page of a website on the Internal Revenue Service, the American tax authorities. And I went there, and it's an absolute treasure trove of information. So they've published the information which relates to the UK. So I was able to find out there exactly what I've been looking for. And it turns out that they own a huge amount, that the turnover of American corporations in the UK is $800 billion a year in the context of a UK economy which is under 4 trillion. So basically more than a fifth of our turnover is paying money to US corporations.
My guest is the veteran economist, entrepreneur, and investor with a career spanning 40 years, Angus Hanton, who is also a public policy expert who co-founded the Intergenerational Foundation, a think tank focused on promoting the interest of younger generations. He is the author of the groundbreaking book and bestseller Vassal State, How America Runs Britain, based on his experience as an economist who analyzes the accumulation of national debts and the transfer of resources to older generations, which he views as passing increasingly unsustainable liabilities to younger people.
What the Americans and also the Germans have been very effective at is encouraging entrepreneurs to build up firms and then retain ownership and keep building them up. Whereas the British have set up a system where if something's successful, we flog it off, a sort of jumble sale. I think one of our problems as well is that domination of our society has started to include our think tanks.
Yes.
So the American think tanks that operate in London have become more influential, and the more neutral think tanks have become more pro-American because they know that's where they're getting their funding. These huge entrepreneurs, you gave the example of Larry Ellison, they're capable of changing a think tank's orientation and program of work by who they choose to fund. And I've heard this as a conversation. They say to a founder, and I'm sure this has been said many times, look, you can sell out to us. Here's what we're offering. It's a good price. It'll give you and your family cash. It's not as much as you want, but your alternative is that we'll poach your staff and we'll compete with you. And if you're a founder in that situation, you're not just considering the value of the offer, you're considering the ongoing existence of your business. And that sort of negotiation is obviously done verbally and can be done in coded terms. But the founder knows that he or she, usually he, but not always, is being offered the choice between selling out or going out of business, if that's become an area that the tech company is interested in.
This is a CEO Retort podcast, the show that fearlessly goes after the difficult topics that we all need to talk about, campaigns for issues that we're all concerned about, and invites some amazing, inspiring, and remarkable guests who will help us navigate through this fragile world that we all care about. I'm Tim Al-Sheikh. Let's get after it.
You are listening to CEO
State. But I love your profile on your website that you're a self-confessed baby boomer, economist, and entrepreneur. So that really suggests, of course, that you've been in business economics for a very, very long time. Without revealing your age, but it just shows that you've, I'm quite familiar with your work, but you know a lot about American business and global economics, etc., which is so relevant in today's world because, as you know, we talked about this just before we started recording, that at the time of the recording of this episode, yesterday, the Financial Times reported that the stock market, the entire stock market is dependent, or 80% of the stock market dependent on the AI bubble. So it's literally floating barely on the AI bubble. And I know you watched my conversation with Jeffrey Funk, where we were talking about this bubble is basically on the verge of explosion.
Yes.
So am I right in saying that, it's even worse than what Jeffrey and I have been talking about, if 80% effectively of the American economy is floating on that bubble?
Yes. To answer the first question, I am 65, so I'm young by the standards of American presidents. But
so you qualify.
I don't apply for any political position, certainly not in America. There are two issues here with AI, aren't there? There's the question of whether the current bubble is sustainable, but there's also the question of who dominates it. And it's very clear that AI is almost totally US dominated in terms of the innovation, the research that's going on there, the commercialization, the standards, and the hosting, effectively the control. So they're all with the US, and to a limited extent China, to a more limited extent, but China's obviously working very hard. So it is a bipolar approach, with America being in the lead at the moment. But any idea, such as Keir Starmer has suggested, that Britain might have a significant role, is just pie in the sky and optimism. The big players are OpenAI, obviously, but also Google. And interestingly, one of their big parts of their AI is DeepMind, which was a London-based startup. And to my mind, the British shouldn't be allowing successful startups like that to be taken over. Amazon's big, Meta's very big, AMD, IBM. So and of course the hosting companies, Oracle and the parts of Amazon Web Services, Microsoft. These are the huge companies that dominate AI, and of course it's virtually the third anniversary now of when ChatGPT was launched and AI became a publicly available thing, and it's improved so much. I subscribed almost straight away, even though I was subscribing to a US corporation, $20 a month. I just felt it was so powerful and so useful, and it's become more and more powerful. It changes a lot, and what it's doing is when they open a new data center in the UK, the current Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, celebrates it and says this is inward investment. But really what she's celebrating is the fact that the Americans are using a new technology to hollow out British industry. So as indeed happened with big tech, with retail internet, with organizations like Amazon, and with Microsoft, and with the social media, of course. It's slightly absurd that the electronic town square is definitely in California, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp or any of these platforms, apart from TikTok. They're all based in America and mostly on the West Coast, and so we've allowed our social media and our discussions to be moderated from America. So it's not obvious what to do about it, but it's certainly that AI is a US dominated, US driven thing, and that the British are takers of whatever they're offered, and they pay for it. But do you see it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I fully agree with you. I was part of the same ecosystem as DeepMind back in the day, and the thing that I complained a lot about, and I still do, is the fact that the UK has always been overly reliant on the American tech. So I talk a lot about how London AI was actually growing. We were above China at the time, but actually it was Google that was making it. Google Campus is part of Google, right? So that ecosystem was created by Google. It brought us all together in that one ecosystem. Obviously, they acquired DeepMind. But even DeepMind, and the one of their investors revealed a couple of years ago, I think, and I even did mention this on the podcast a while back, that DeepMind was practically broke. They didn't have they ran out of money. And if it weren't for Google's acquisition, there would have been no DeepMind. And loads of AI companies, mine included. I mean, we struggled to raise funds. I mean, investors didn't particularly understand AI. By the way, they still don't, most of them. And the government funds were pretty crap, frankly. Like, they're just peanuts. And compared, like as you said, compared to the level of investment that you see in Silicon Valley, I mean, we're nothing. And China as well. Obviously, China, they invested heavily in AI, and of course, they're growing. I mean, it's all the money. And I think even though we had the brains, but we didn't have the money. And I always made that joke, which probably is controversial, but hey, I'm biased, that in London, we had all the brains, Silicon Valley had the money. So,
but they've got a lot of brains too, and they've developed an ecosystem that so successfully funds startups, but it doesn't just fund any startups. They're very effective at sorting which ones have real promise and which ones are run by people who are more likely to succeed. They made an absolute science of that, and the volumes of capital, but also they've got an ecosystem that allows the bigger tech companies to pick over those startups and either invest in them or ultimately take them over. And that's very hard to compete with. But there's another thing, which is that startups in the UK, if they're successful, the whole way they're set up usually makes it of interest for the founders to sell out. They're often youngish men who've got young families or would like to have young families, and a few million quid transforms their life. Whereas that may be far less than their real potential value of their stake. So there's that, but they're also working with investors, and investors in the UK are always asking the question, what is the exit strategy?
Yes.
Investors, once the value has gone up significantly, the investors are saying, right, how can we sell out? How can we get our money out? So there's huge pressure on the from themselves and from others on the founders to sell out. But there's another factor which the government could do something about, which is this: if they make a profit, they pay corporation tax on it, and the money stays in the company. And until recently, it was far better for them to sell out, and it still is, because that they effectively get their at worst they pay 24% tax, and at best they pay, for one slice of it, 0, and another slice 10%. So they pay far less tax by selling out than carrying on. And what the Americans and also the Germans have been very effective at is encouraging entrepreneurs to build up firms and then retain ownership and keep building them up. Whereas the British have set up a system where if something's successful, we flog it off, a sort of jumble sale. So it really matters what happens to your companies once they succeed, and we saw it, of course, with ARM, the chip designer based in Cambridge technically, but owned effectively in the US. That the existing shareholders couldn't resist taking a profit, and if they were institutional shareholders, they were getting that. For example, pension funds, they were taking that profit tax free, and they were taking it straight away instead of having to wait for their money. So we've set up a system where we've encouraged what's sometimes been called vulture capitalism. We've encouraged a situation where it pays Americans to take, but we're willing to sell.
Which kind of brings us nicely to your book, Vassal State. And for the listeners, even though this book is quite UK centered, but actually I think everything that you've said in the book is quite relevant to other countries, because the big tech is doing exactly the same thing in most countries, I believe, probably. So,
absolutely.
But let's start with the UK, because obviously UK is one of the largest economies in the world. So the fact that they managed to turn the UK into the 51st state, right, the vassal state of the US, that means they can do that with any country. So how did what was the trigger point behind the book?
Okay, well, the trigger point behind the book was, like so many other projects that start, you ask an innocent question, and I asked the innocent question to myself, I wonder how much of the UK is owned by American corporations So I thought that's a straightforward question. I'll go online, probably Google at that point, and I'll be able to look it up and it'll say 15% or 10% or something. Well, the first thing that astonished me about that, as it were, trigger question is that no one knew. No one had recorded it. No one had studied it. It kind of falls between business and economics, really. So it didn't fall within any particular academic discipline. So no one had thought about it. They just said, oh, they own a few things over here. So I thought, I started by thinking, well, I'll look into this. And eventually I thought, well, there's a lot to this. So I wonder if it would justify a book. And I spoke to an agent, and he said, yes, that sounds like it'd be a really interesting book. I'll speak to publishers. And I put together a proposal and they said, yes, that seems to be worth doing. By then I'd done quite a lot of work on it. And of course, afterwards I did further work. And so my research started with this question. And I thought, well, the right thing to do is to ask the British government if they know how much of the UK is owned by American companies and American individuals. And so I asked them, with a Freedom of Information request and some phone calls and some online research. And most of the departments, like the Office for National Statistics, Department of Work and Pensions, they said they really hadn't got any idea. Department of Work and Pensions, I was asking them how many UK workers are employed by American companies. So I wasn't just asking about ownership. Eventually, I managed to find that I discovered that there was an OECD project whose main intention was to collect more tax. And in order to do that, they set up a questionnaire that every OECD country was going to implement to ask multinationals what their turnover was in different countries, what their profits were, how many staff they had, what business sectors they were in. And when I realized that was happening, I thought, well, the British must know the answer to these questions then. So I did a FOI, Freedom of Information request, to HMRC, the tax authority, which happens to be based in Newcastle. And they said, we don't know. So I nagged them and said, you must know. And then eventually they said, actually, sorry, we were wrong there. We do know. I said, great, tell us then. And they said, but we've decided we can't tell you. It's too secret, this information. It's necessary for government discussions that this isn't generally known. And I thought, hold on, this is collected at taxpayers' expense, and you ought to tell us. But then I found one very nice individual in Newcastle who said, well, I know we can't tell you, but by the way, this information is available on an obscure website, on the obscure page of a website on the Internal Revenue Service, the American tax authorities. And I went there and it's an absolute treasure trove of information. So they've published the information which relates to the UK. So I was able to find out there exactly what I've been looking for. And it turns out that they own a huge amount, that the turnover of American corporations in the UK is $800 billion a year in the context of a UK economy which is under 4 trillion. So basically more than a fifth of our turnover is paying money to US corporations. And bear in mind our turnover, or GDP, as a country, bear in mind that a lot of that is rents and labour, which you wouldn't expect to be American. So it was a very large proportion. And then I found, I started looking at kind of the two parts of the detail. The first was individual sectors. So I started looking at things like where I thought, well, where's the profit? Which are the profitable parts of the economy? And the more I looked at the profitable parts, the more I found the Americans had homed in on those. So just for example, with takeaway coffees, which we know to be a profitable sector, we can see it. We spend £3 or £3.50 on a coffee that we know has cost about 30p to produce, including the cup. And I found that McDonald's have a big outlet there, but of course Starbucks do, a US-based company. Costa do, and we think of them as a British company because they used to be, but they're now owned by Coca-Cola. There's the Cafe Nero is owned by an American who happens to live in London. And most of the most of the coffee chain, all the big coffee chains are US owned. So I then thought, well, let's look at something else. Let's think if we're thinking of going, what we might do at breakfast time, drink coffee. Let's look at the cereal companies. And I found that those were US owned. So Quaker Oats was owned by PepsiCo, and Weetabix, which used to be a UK company. We think of UK companies by appointment to the Queen, might be King now. I'm not sure if they've changed the logo, but Weetabix is US owned now. And of course, Kellogg's obviously is. But so are most of the cereals in the supermarket. And then I thought, well, let's look around the supermarket and see what else is US owned. And I found that so many of the big brands, almost all the big brands, even the ones that we think of as sort of quintessentially British, like Cadbury's, that's been taken over by Kraft, and ones that we don't know about, that we think, I wonder who owns Uncle Ben's rice, for example, and we find that's owned by Mars Corporation, or things that are profitable but perhaps not high profile unless you're a pet owner, like Pedigree, Chum, and the two main dog food brands are owned by US corporations. So I thought, well, that's one sense in which the Americans own a lot. But then, of course, there's all the tech, which we've alluded to earlier on, where all the big tech companies are US, except Spotify is an exception. But Swedish owned, but the point is that there are so few exceptions, whether it's TikTok or Spotify, that everything else is US owned and controlled. And then I thought, well, let's think about the tax, how much tax they pay. And I found it was extraordinary that where a UK company will pay 25% tax, the American companies had kind of made a sport of keeping their tax rate low, basically avoiding, that doesn't mean evading. So within the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law, keeping their tax rates right down. And I found that they use transfer pricing, which basically means they make payments offshore for the use of the trademarks. So they use transfer pricing, and they use many other techniques to reduce their UK tax. So I found they were paying on their profits of typically £80 billion a year. They were paying about more like 10% than 25% tax. But actually their profits are far greater than that, because there are quite a lot of companies who sell into the UK from Luxembourg and Ireland. So we all know companies that we might have bought a phone from based in Ireland, or companies where you might have done a DNA test, so ancestry.com, for example, where you'll send off your sample to Ireland because it's a US company sensibly basing itself offshore. And so actually their profits are far greater than the figures that the IRS table showed me. They give the profits for Ireland and Luxembourg as well. So, and Holland, a lot goes through Amsterdam. So one can kind of piece together, their turnover and their profits from those. So it was a combination of these things. It's a long answer to a short question, but the more I got into it, the more interesting it became. And it also became clear how systematic the Americans have been with their takeover. And it's not as if they've met much resistance. We've welcomed them. The politicians over the last 20 years and more have constantly welcomed the Americans and talked about how much they like this inward investment. But very often, sometimes it's real inward investment, like real new capital, building things and building up businesses. But more often than not, it's not inward investment in that sense. It's selling off the assets. It's the Americans coming in and buying our businesses, often at very low, really what turn out to be very low prices, and then capturing the profit and sending it to the US. So, for example, just before the beginning of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were three big UK defense companies which the American Department of Defense in the US had always had its eye on. So Ultra and Cobham, for example, and the Americans had wanted to buy them, and they bought them just before that war started. And so that they've been very effective at buying our businesses, and we've been totally ineffective at protecting them from takeover.
Wow. I mean, how did this start? I mean, because obviously you mentioned it's been going on for well over 20 years. So we're talking about multiple governments, because I can assure, I'm sure people will be thinking, oh, it's probably the Conservatives that did it and stuff. But obviously it happened even under Labour as well, and including our current Labour government. So it seems that it doesn't really matter who's in government. It seems to be like you said, it's a systematic approach to selling off our assets to the US. So
yes,
when did this whole start, and why?
I think it started with what you might call an Atlanticist approach to life in Britain, where we relied
special relationship.
Special relationship. Yes. Exactly. We relied on our partnership with the Americans, and we thought there was no threat. We assumed they were friends, and we didn't worry about the takeover of our businesses and the beginning of domination by another country. And it's not just the takeovers, of course, of big brands, the takeovers by traditional corporations. There's been a huge wave of takeovers by private equity. So that's very much under the radar. I mean, people talk about private, and it's a very good name because most of the public don't know what private equity is, and they think of it like venture capital. They think that it's risky capital that people are putting up. That could not be further from the truth when it comes to private equity. They take very few risks. The private equity boys, and I say that because it is a male-dominated industry, they know the businesses they take over very well, and they're not new startups. They're businesses that have reliable, growing cash flows, and they're taking them over often, usually with leverage, with a lot of borrowing, and they're systematic about it. They can take out costs, which of course in reality means reducing the labor force and making people redundant. So they take out costs when they can, which may be a sensible business strategy, but it has repercussions for the staff of these companies. They increase prices when they can. Again, might be a reasonable business strategy, but they're more effective at it, I think, than others, and sometimes quite short term about it. And they, like other businesses, they want to dominate their sectors. So they often go for sectors where they have market power and pricing power. But the other thing they do, of course, is they take out the tax. When there's a takeover or they often take out the tax, and that even when they don't take it all out, they take out a lot of it. So one of the characteristics of these basically financial engineers is that they make the businesses they buy much more profitable. And one element of that is to pay less tax. And obviously they're doing it in ways that are legal, but certainly not ways that were intended or foreseeable for the British government. And so this wave of private equity takeovers has added to the multinationals taking over UK companies and the penetration of our markets by tech firms. So it's, it has happened under every government, and I think in a way this current government is one of the worst because it's got so bad, and they've been sort of, and it's not just my book, but other commentators have put them on notice about what's happening. And Nick Clegg was using the term Vassal State in the last few weeks to say, look, we've allowed ourselves to be controlled by another country, and they're kind of on notice now in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. So they should be aware of what's happening. And yet, when Rachel Reeves announces more investment in the country, she's constantly giving praise to essentially businesses that are hollowing out the UK economy. And I did a bit of a study on inward investment to distinguish between, and I spoke to the Office for National Statistics in Newport. So that's the main place in which government collects data. And I said to them, surely you must make a distinction between someone like Nissan, who set up a new factory in the northeast near Newcastle, and who invest real money in buildings and in plant, and who employ local people and train local people, something that surely we all agree is a good thing. And they manufacture cars that are sold across Europe, which has made Britain a significant car exporter. but from effectively this sort of investment. Toyota have done a similar thing. And that sort of investment is good inward investment, but the Office for National Statistics put in the same bucket the sale of a company like Viridor, which is a waste disposal company, which was always profitable and has been sold off to a US private equity company, or recently Spectris, which is a valves and controls company, which was quoted on the London Stock Exchange, which has just been bought out by Advent. I think there was a bit of a bidding war between Advent and KKR, two of the big US private equity companies. But my point is that these takeovers should be categorized differently from real inward investment. And we know that, I mean, Jeremy Hunt's been so a Conservative Chancellor has been the same as Rachel Reeves. He's just been praising the big number of what we can get from selling our assets. Is this conflation by design? Because I was about to also ask you when you started doing that research for your book, and you said that you were asking some very simple questions that should be available in the public domain, and they weren't available. You basically relied on American data to find out about what's going on in the UK. So is this by design, or is it incompetence, or both? Perhaps. Oh, very good question, Tim. I think it's a bit of both. There's definitely incompetence there. I mean, when I spoke to the ONS about this, they said, oh yes, a lot of people have asked us to separate out the two sorts of inward investment, the real investment and the selling off of assets, and we're thinking of doing it. But I got the impression they've been thinking of doing it for a long time. And if they said to the government, if the government were competent, they would say, look, this is not just something that would be a nice to have. This is essential that you get the data separated out and you stop treating inward investment as all being good. You distinguish between that which is useful and that which is more predatory. So I think there's a good dose of incompetence combined with a little bit of with an additional dose of by design, wanting to hide the facts. I think when it comes to AI, for example, I think the government are quite keen to continue this myth that London is a great entrepreneurial centre of AI. I mean, most of the...
Not anymore. Sorry to say it. Not anymore. It used to be. I mean, we're not bad. I'm not saying we're bad, but compared to the way we were pre-Brexit, nothing like that. Not anymore.
Also, what happens is you get the government give tax credits to people who do R&D. Very generous tax credits. So if you're a company like Google, for example, and I haven't studied the extent to which that particular company does it, but a company such as them, they would want to put their R&D in London just as long as those tax credits exist. But it would still be American-owned technology. It would still be used across the world. And the moment you take away the tax credits, the research will move elsewhere. So it's a very the same goes for film credits. There's a lot of tax advantages to making films in the UK, but the moment that tax credit goes, the films will be made in Spain or in Mexico or in the US. They'll be made elsewhere. Those aren't the sort of tax. That's not the way it's marketed. What the government say is we're giving these tax credit so that an industry can become established here. But that's not really what happens. They get used, and then the companies move on if the credits get removed. And effectively, what it does is it just reduces the UK's tax base.
Yeah, but going back again, because you see, all of that makes sense in terms of what's going on. But I'm still struggling with the why questions. It's like, why did this all happen? Because I mean, one can argue, I suppose, that it may have started under Thatcher, because obviously the sort of the libertarian capitalism really emerged under Reagan and Thatcher, and the two of them were very close, and arguably they're the architects. I mean, obviously you can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm not the economist, you're the economist, but from my understanding, these two were effectively the architects of libertarian capitalism, which is, different from what I describe as the original quote unquote capitalism. I mean, so has this really started under Thatcher, or were there any evidence that sort of sell-off started even before Thatcher, post the Second World War, for whatever reason?
Well, there is a good question. There is a history of US companies establishing profitable operations in the UK well before Thatcherism. So when Ford established its plant in Dagenham, that was a lot earlier. And tire companies established their businesses here. But I think it started with Thatcher, but I wouldn't necessarily blame her. I think she would be horrified by the way its politicians have allowed it to work through. I mean, of our quoted companies, when Thatcher was in power, 5% of their shares were owned by American investors. It's now over 30%. And when she was Prime Minister, there was real industry. There were lots more companies than there are now. And I think she would have, had she stayed in power, and I think 10 years was probably enough of Thatcher, had she stayed in power and lived on another 10 years as Prime Minister, I think she would have started to say, this is absurd, the extent to which we're selling out. I mean, there was a famous debate really about Westland helicopters, which became, and it led to Michael Heseltine resigning from the cabinet, and challenging Thatcher for the Conservative leadership. But the Westland helicopters discussion was basically a British company that had become unviable, and the question was, should it be sold to the Americans or should it be sold to the Europeans? And Heseltine was very keen for it to be kept as at least a European company, and Thatcher overruled him. And I think that's another area in which our politicians have failed to do what's best for the country. So in terms of having stronger links with Europe, I mean, I'm a Remainer, or if you like, a rejoiner. I mean, we've got this. There are these three great trading blocs in the world, aren't there? There's China and the Far East. There's America and there's Europe. Of course, there are exceptions. There are odd extra countries. There's Russia and Australia, and there's a question of what Japan's role in all this is. But in terms of trading, you've got these three blocks, and Britain lies 20 miles off the coast of Europe and has lots of historical links with Europe. And we're 2,000 miles from the nearest part of mainland America. And it seems absurd to be trying to partner in terms of trade with all the geography that's implied in the transport, to say nothing of cultural and institutional things. It seems absurd to be trying to partner so much with America when we've got Europe on our doorstep, and a Europe that's surprisingly friendly towards us. I mean, we were
surprisingly,
well, really. The admiration of the Europeans for their tolerance of the British. I mean, we were a thorn in the side of the EU for so long. We were awkward, we were obstreperous, and yet they still probably would have us back. And that's something that I think, from the point of view of the interests of the British people, is something that we should do. So clearly, I'm a Remainer, but it's for logical reasons. This isn't some sentimental thing. It's the natural trading bloc for us to be part of. And if we're left out in the cold, as we have been, or put ourselves out in the cold, then the Americans are in a hugely strong negotiating position. I mean, because trade isn't really about doing each other favors; it's about trading favors, and foreign policy isn't about having friends. It's about having people with shared interests and having allies. So the Americans are absolutely not stupid. They're extremely good negotiators. I'm not sure about Mr. Trump, but as a nation they are, and they're effective. And if they see that Britain has isolated itself from Europe, they're not exactly going to give us favors. They're going to say, well, you need us now. And indeed, it's happened with the trade deal. So there's a long history about this trade deal, which has now been announced, but it hasn't really been inked in, and the detail hasn't been agreed. And ever since the beginning of Boris Johnson's government and before, the British wanted a trade deal. Basically since Brexit, they wanted a trade deal with the US, and the US has said, well, it's not really in our interest to give you one, and sort of promised that they'll give them one. the British one, and when they do, it's very much on American terms. So, for example,
well, we were desperate. I mean, we were desperate for a deal, and in business, if you're desperate, everybody else will take full advantage of you.
Absolutely, and we put ourselves into a desperate position, and that means that whenever the British want to do something like limit the influence of tech companies, or, for example, introduce a digital services tax, which, just to clarify what that is, the big tech companies are very hard to tax. So the British government under Philip Hammond said, well, the simplest thing to do is to say that for many of those several of those bigger companies, the right way to tax them is a tiny amount on their turnover. So whatever profits they say they've got, we'll tax some of their turnover, maybe just a couple of % of their turnover. So when we know that Google or Facebook are making a lot of profit, but they don't declare much, this way we'll make sure we can collect some tax from them. So that was his reasoning. Now, this digital services tax, it's clear that the Americans don't want it, and that the American politicians, and particularly the leaders in Washington, the president and his team, have said, look, if you want your deal, you need to drop your digital services tax. And so that's the example of the sort of thing that the Americans can effectively stop the British from doing. The Americans have so much influence on our political policy as well. I mean, we only really do what they want. In the book, the way I describe it is that they're not interested in things that don't matter to them. So it's not as if they interfere in every area of policy, because it doesn't matter to them what we do about, I don't know, gay rights or what we do about how we organize our schools. These are important issues for us, but what does matter to them is trading terms. What does matter to them is how we regulate tech. It matters to them how we organize our defense industry. It matters to them what sort of suppliers we use for the NHS, which is very much dominated by US suppliers, not just the drug, but all sorts of other elements of the NHS. So they use that power to take an interest in the things that matter to them. And then when they do, it's clear that the British comply. There are too many levers for Keir Starmer not to do so. We saw an example when Boris Johnson was in power, where the Americans wanted to stop the use of certain equipment in our certain Chinese equipment in our telecoms infrastructure. And the British initially said, "Oh, we don't mind. It's not a risk to national security." And the Americans said, "Well, this is Huawei equipment. Well, actually, we do care. You better take it out of your systems." And eventually, the British were strong-armed into promising to withdraw Huawei equipment from all our mobile telecoms systems. And guess what? The alternative supplier is probably Cisco, a US company. So they were not only benefiting from beating up the Chinese, which the Americans wanted to do, but they were benefiting commercially from us British companies having to buy American. And the reason that example is interesting is because it was a very public one. Yes. For every one like that, there must be a dozen or 2 dozen which just go below the radar, where the UK government is thinking about how to do things, and on a quiet, the Americans have a quiet word in their ear and say, "This is how we'd like you to do it." And that particularly applies to defence. So it's we are in this sense very much subject to what the Americans want. I mean, I suppose a vassal state can be defined as someone who does what they're told and does it for the benefit of the master state. So that's I mean, I've tried to avoid too much reference to the term colonial, but in a sense, I mean, you've referred to it, Tim, of talking about the 51st state. We are, in a sense, their colony. And if you've got a colony, historically, that's been something from which, one talks about benign support, but the reality is economic extraction.
And it's even worse right now. I mean, because I complained a lot about the current investment. What was it? The 500 billion or whatever it is. I can't remember the number. Like a couple of $100 billion investment in building infrastructure for AI in the UK and stuff. And when I looked at the detail, effectively, we don't own anything. It's owned entirely by the US. So even though they're building the infrastructure here, but they own the intellectual property of that infrastructure. This is something, by the way, that you don't see in Europe, because the Europeans, and I know this because I'm building bridges, for example, with Finland, I'm trying to set up in there. So they've built their own data centers in there, and they have the same investment from NVIDIA, Microsoft, etc. But Finland owns the intellectual property. So there's some kind of agreement, which is fantastic. But that's not what we have here. And I made a point on LinkedIn that basically the tech sector in the UK now is dead in the waters. It's basically, there's absolutely no point of being a tech entrepreneur in the UK anymore. I mean, I know it sounds a bit hyperbolic, but if you want the kind of growth and innovation that we had like just 10 years ago, that's not going to happen unless you're entirely dependent on American companies. I'm actually one of our competitors. I don't know if I should be, I'm not going to mention the names, but people who know probably will know anyway who I'm talking about. But we have, because my company, Nebula, we launched it sort of in January 2019. And there was another startup kind of started around the same time as us as well. And recently they've been basically dismantled by Anthropic, and they're a good company. I respect, they are competitors, but I still respect people when they innovate and come up with great ideas. And I thought the founders are pretty cool guys. And the tech is great, but they were dismantled by Anthropic. Basically what they've done, they didn't buy the company. They basically hired the founders. They convinced the founders to quit their own company, basically screwing over their own investors and I suppose their employees, because they didn't hire everybody. So effectively, the company was not sold, but rather there's a term, I can't remember what the term is, but it's like a quasi acquisition without actually paying for the company, but they just hire the founders. Microsoft, by the way, did that with Mustafa Suleyman's startup a year ago with Inflection, because Inflection had the second highest investment after OpenAI. They were building their own model. Microsoft was an investor, but Microsoft, for whatever reason, said, you know what, dismantle this. So Mustafa Suleyman joined Microsoft as their AI CEO, and Inflection, well, it kind of exists. I don't know what it does right now, but definitely, this is the kind of thing that we're seeing. It's like, they're not even acquiring the companies anymore. They're like, we like the founders. You guys are really clever. Screw your own company. Come and work for us. We'll pay you $1 million salary. I mean, this is terrible.
It is, and it gives an illustration of the powerful position that the big tech companies find themselves in and have promoted themselves to be in, which is, and I've heard this as a conversation, they say to a founder, and I'm sure this has been said many times, look, you can sell out to us. Here's what we're offering. It's a good price. It'll give you and your family cash. It's not as much as you want, but your alternative is that we'll poach your staff and we'll compete with you. And if you're a founder in that situation, you're not just considering the value of the offer, you're considering the ongoing existence of your business. And that sort of negotiation is obviously done verbally and can be done in coded terms. But the founder knows that he or she, usually he, but not always, is being offered the choice between selling out or going out of business, if that's become an area that the tech company is interested in. But you spoke about Finland owning their data centers, and this goes to the heart of the British problem, that they've taken the view for many years that ownership doesn't matter, that it doesn't matter who owns our businesses, because at least they're paying tax and they're employing people and they're based here. But it turns out, when you look at it, that ownership really does matter, because when the chips are down, when things are tough, if you own the business, you can make the decisions about it. You can make the hiring, firing decisions. You can decide, as Cadbury's did, for example, to stop making so much of the chocolate in the UK, but to get it made in Poland. So you can make those strategic decisions, and the host country is powerless. So it does seem that ownership matters. But you also gave the example in the case of AI and the data centers, that the US corporations coming in own the data centers, Microsoft is the prominent recent one. But of course, what they don't own is the network of telecoms cables that are used for transferring the data. But it doesn't.
The energy as well. Energy supply.
Exactly. But it doesn't matter to them that they don't own those, because those are kind of passive things that they can use and that they know the government has to keep because the government wants their citizens to have access to it. So that becomes a sort of slave asset that's working for that company without being remunerated. There've been quite a lot of issues raised about that in France and Germany, where they say our network of cables and wires is being used but not paid for by the big tech companies. And so there's been some arguments over that. So that a company like BT, which is UK owned, that will really lose out because vast profits are being made through its wires and cables, but it's not seeing them. There are a lot of indirect issues where what we need is a government that understands the extent to which the country is being used and concentrates on doing something about it. And there are plenty of things they can do about it. They can authorize BT to charge, to make charges for traffic, or they can make their own charges for it, or they can make levies on the tech companies to contribute towards the infrastructure. But the first stage to any sort of cure of these problems, and it goes right across the board, is a good diagnosis. You can't just start curing a problem. You need to understand it and appreciate it. And that's, in a way, where our government is still at the first base camp, or not even at the base camp. This particular Everest, they need to start to understand it. And that's where I started with the book. I started with saying, let's start by measuring, because my view is that the solution to this, whatever solution you have, it starts by measuring the extent of foreign involvement. And you referred, Tim, to other countries. And I think, and the problem of US tech dominating other countries and making them into somewhat vassal states, they like us need to start by doing a lot more measuring. I mean, in France and Germany, they're instinctively aware of this problem because they've since the war, they've so much suffered from adverse foreign investment, as well as some useful foreign investment. And so they start off being suspicious of foreign owners, and sometimes they can end up having confidence in them and supporting them. But we start off with the opposite position in the UK. We start off trusting them without any evidence for doing so. And that, I think, has been very helpful to private equity and to all the other takeovers.
And is this because the politicians just don't understand business? I'm just trying to, because one of the things that they'll go on about, as you know, is that we want to focus on buy British, for example, or invest in British businesses, etc. And I'm like, yeah, but but you've literally sold off all whatever that is British has been now sold off to the Americans. So, and I'm thinking to myself, as we're explaining, I suppose that it's sort of two questions combined into one. Has this become worse post Brexit because that we're out of the EU? But then if these things actually started to take place pre-Brexit, then that means us being part of the EU wouldn't have made any difference. I don't know. But then the second question is like, speaking from the conservative point of view, but then I suppose, Labour are kind of the same, when they're talking about capitalism, where, government shouldn't be involved all the time. It's like, let the markets do their thing, etc. But then if the markets are saying, well, actually, okay, let's prioritize the Americans, which basically you screw over the British. So that kind of goes against everything. It's everything's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? It's like they're saying, oh, invest in Britain first or whatever. Oh, but sell it all to the Americans, which is not Britain first, right? So it's like, it's very messy. It's like my brain can't handle this. And I'm just wondering, has Brexit made it worse? And is the key problem, I presume, that the politicians in power, they just don't understand business. They talk the talk, but they're not the ones who are basically seem to know what they're talking about effectively.
There are very, very few politicians who've actually ever had to make the payroll, who've ever had to worry about whether at the end of the month their staff are going to be paid. Very
That's
few
the problem.
Who've got involved in real investment decisions in the business. There are a few. So in that sense, all their business is theoretical. And when they talk about free markets, the market's never completely free, because after all, there's a question of tax. That's decided by central government, and that distorts markets. There's a question of regulation. It's a question of what's allowed. And that's always going to be something to some extent is determined by government. So there's never really a free market. And we've also made the mistake of thinking that a free market means anyone can buy our businesses. You can have a free trading market and still protect your companies. The Americans protect their companies.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen it over, and not just their own companies, but companies that are trading in their country. We've seen it over TikTok, where they realized that their markets were their social media was starting to be very much controlled and influenced by TikTok. So they said, right, we're going to stop this. And they did do so. So the idea of free markets needs to be pinned down and looked at a lot more carefully. But as you say, politicians are mostly really not aware of sort of how to run a business, and it turns out how to regulate a business. But I found out something else while I was writing the book, which slightly surprised me: the extent to which the senior politicians have links with the US. Now, I'm not saying they're in their pocket, but I'm saying culturally they're very aligned. So when you look at prime ministers and chancellors, almost all of them in the last 25, 30 years have either worked for American companies before they got into office, or they've had some American education, like an MBA, or they've worked for American companies after they leave office, indicating their cultural alignment. So even someone like Gordon Brown, who we tend to think of as solidly left-wing and wouldn't be corrupted by American influence, as soon as he left office, he took a consultancy role with JP Morgan. And you can see he was attracted by the money, and he just thought, well, I'm advising them and I'll advise them to do things that are right. But either way, he was much more aligned with American ways of thinking. And Theresa May did a speaking tour in the US, but some have been very American. I mean, someone like Rishi Sunak, when he was, even when he was chancellor, he had a green card, which is normally seen as the first step to becoming an American citizen. He'd worked for Goldman Sachs. He'd studied at, I think, Stanford, and he's had business interests at one stage when he was over on a British mission to as chancellor to the US. He took a couple of days off to speak to businessmen privately. I'm not saying he was doing his own deals. I'm giving an illustration of the extent of his closeness. He owns a flat on the west coast, an apartment on the west coast of the US, and in a way, nothing wrong with that. I'm not criticizing him for having American links, but I'm illustrating how culturally and in business terms, British leaders are kind of in awe or in thrall to the American way of doing things, the American way of thinking, and that's also true of leaders of the FTSE 100 companies. They've I think slightly over half of them have some American link, whether it's having done an MBA or having worked for an American corporation. So the flavor of our quoted companies is very Anglo-American or American, and those links really matter when it comes to how they think about business and how they respond to a takeover approach or to a business deal. But actually, just to give context I referred to the leaders of the FTSE 100 companies. There are now about 3 US companies which are individually worth more than all our larger quoted companies put together. So Apple and Nvidia and Microsoft are each worth more now than all our companies merged together. So our quoted companies are really quite a small beer now in the scheme of things,
which effectively makes our country a lot poorer.
It does.
In addition to Brexit, so we already lost. I mean, we were losing what is it, 0.4 of our GDP, 0.4% of our GDP every year on year post Brexit. That in addition to that, I mean, that means we're a poorer country, no?
Well, when I was writing Vassal State, a lot of people said to me, "Okay, so we're controlled and somewhat owned by the Americans, but am I bothered?" They said, "Why should I care? Why does it matter?" And I thought about this for quite a while, and I thought, well, I can see their point. It's not they don't see it as affecting their lives directly, and they think they're a benign enough owner. We don't care. But when I looked at it, it turns out that it really does matter, because it's a constant flow of wealth across the Atlantic in the westerly direction. So that each year, those profits that I've mentioned of maybe 100 billion a year, roughly more than half the cost of running the NHS, each year the value of that value is being transferred to American owners, and that the corresponding part is that impoverishing our country. So that's the big thing. There's a flow of wealth, but there's also a shift in control. So decisions about food safety and about standards have moved to Washington and California rather than being decided in London or in other parts of the UK. But there's also a flow of people. Many of the most talented people, it doesn't require very many, but of the very best, they can be lured to the US, even if it wasn't their original career plan to work in the US. If you get paid enough and you're valued enough and you get status, and we've seen this not just in business, but in academia. Yes. I mean, I spoke to quite a few people who said, look, if you're a talented professor of a subject, it's quite tempting to go to the States when you'll typically get paid twice as much, you'll be given free housing, and you'll have support staff. So instead of filling in all those tedious forms that professors have to do, someone else will do it for you. And on top of that, you'll be more highly respected than you are in the UK.
So there's a bigger appreciation as a professor in America than there is in here, actually. That's true. Yeah.
Yes, especially in technical subjects and scientific subjects, medical subjects. So there's a loss of wealth. There's a loss of control. There's a brain drain, as it used to be called. But and finally, and more emotively, perhaps there's a transfer of treasure. If an antique or a work of art is for sale because the owner has to sell, for example, or because they need the money or they can't afford to look after it anymore, that will. There's a system where the British various museums and galleries in Britain have first right to buy it, but very often they say we can't afford to. And institutions like the Getty Museum say, well, we can afford to, we'll buy it. And there've been many cases where the British wanted to keep works of art, but the Americans outbid them. And the flow of treasure, as I call it, so works of art and paintings and so on, the flow of treasure from the UK to the US is about £2 billion a year. It's quite a lot. We're talking about a lot of works of art. Now, of course, you could say, well, some of that, if it's really old, is American history as well as being British history. But there's certainly no matching flow of treasure or goods in the European direction. So it really matters. It really and we've seen that particularly with the since the publication of the book, the change in geopolitics. We used to assume when Biden was in power that the Americans would always be on the side of the Europeans and would always be against the Russians in relation to Ukraine, and now we see that we can't rely on those alliances and the American support in the same way, which is maybe not a bad thing to force the Europeans to be more independent and more self-sufficient and more self-determining. But if we're going to do that, British should be with the Europeans in that debate.
And I wonder if it's too late, because when you mentioned that, for example, going back to the original point that you made, that a lot of these political leaders, they've got very strong alignment with the US culturally and stuff. Which to me, I'm thinking, well, so what? I mean, like I've got family in America. I'm very strong.
Me too.
When I lived. Yeah, exactly. But not only that, I mean, when I was a young kid, I lived in the Middle East, and I went to an American system. That's why my accent is a little bit messed up. I sound Canadian or something. I was told recently. But But the thing is, but that doesn't mean you prioritize America, surely, right? So it's like you can be aligned. Like I'm aligned with America, which means I love using American products. I want to work closely with American businesses, etc. But I'm still like, I am kind of proud Brit. I want to prioritize my country. I want to prioritize my business. So to me, I'm thinking, well, if these politicians go on about, we've got strong alignments with America, but then we put America first, not Britain. And I'm thinking, well, how does that make you patriotic? Just out of interest.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that there's also, I think one of the reasons for the rise in reform and indeed for Brexit is that there's a kind of an elite in the UK, London-based elite of people who are very comfortably off and who, like the rest of us, they love their Google, using Google and Apple products and all the good things or the useful things that come from the US, and they conflate that with feeling, as you say, putting America first, and that, I think that's contributing to the resentment outside London that is fueling the rise of reform.
Because they can see it. They can see it happening, that they're prioritizing other countries more than the UK. Yeah.
And yes, absolutely that. And that they're living in a bubble where they're too inclined to serve their own interests rather than the interests of those outside London. So one can see why it's contributing to the rise of reform. And I think it's about a lot more than immigration.
Yeah.
But I'm surprised that it's not. The paradox is, in a way, that the way it's playing out is that reform happens to be also fairly pro-America.
Exactly. I was about to say they're very pro-America. Like they put America first. Like they're even using American terminology in their campaign for things that don't even exist in the UK. Like Antifa and DEI. I'm like, what are you talking about? We don't have any of that stuff here.
No, so they're not fully articulating some of the resentments and the issues, the concerns of people in Sunderland, for example. So I think many ordinary workers in Sunderland feel. I'm absolutely not saying I support them in this. They believe that immigration is threatening their well-being, their economic livelihoods. But I think what I'm suggesting is that the American economic domination is also doing so, and that they should be very much more aware of and be doing. And they can still have their iPhones and recognize that we don't want to give the country away or indeed sell it off to American corporations. But the new wave of AI really will change a lot of that, because it threatens to put out of business many small accountants and lawyers. Just the sheer power of it will mean that many small businesses can just put their bank statements online, maybe their whole email correspondence, and the AI will be able to draw up their accounts for them, and the local accountant won't have a job. We've seen this already to some extent, and again, I've kind of analysed it a little bit, that an organisation like QuickBooks, Californian, very effective, very helpful accounting software, is being marketed by local accountants and used by local accountants, but ultimately all the power is with QuickBooks. They're the ones who have the computational power. They're the ones that have the record of people's accounts in the cloud going back some time. They're the ones who essentially provide not just the back end, but the kind of most of the service. And ultimately, the local accountants won't be needed. So it's a serious threat to professional firms, but of course that it's also true of many other businesses. Anything with information involved, that British businesses will reduce. It was put quite well, I think, by Jassy, the chief of Amazon, when he said in many departments, including in Amazon, what's happening is AI is allowing that department to carry on functioning at least as well with fewer staff. So he's talking there about the abolition of a department, but he's just saying we don't need so much. And we've seen it in programming for ever since the 1970s. Anyone who learnt code and did programming was guaranteed a job. That is now gone because so many programmers, for a lot of basic coding, which would have taken high paid time, theirs or someone else's, are now using AI to produce that code, and that looks like an increasing tendency. So coding isn't the route, as it has been for so long, to a secure job, and that will affect many people in the UK as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, interesting. I like to say, in terms of the current AI that we have, it really emphasizes skills as a human. Basically, you have to be a highly skilled individual to secure your job, because it's like as you know, before, like I said, like if you're a programmer, you're guaranteed a job. But I personally was always against this idea that you hire people, because you see a lot of companies, especially in the world of tech and startups, when they talk about growth, they always talk about how many people they've hired. But then you look at them, but you don't really need half of these people anyway. So why are you hiring them in the first place? So sometimes I always question that. And I think what AI, and in fact data science behind the AI, it always exposes these sort of weaknesses. And basically what AI now highlighted is that actually you need the highly skilled people, and people with lower skills, actually AI can do a lot of their jobs already. But yes, the problem that I'm seeing with employers, because they don't understand AI, they think that they can use AI to replace everyone, including the skilled people. So hence they get this really weird, shitstorm, basically. Like you see like a major backlash. We've seen that, for example, with Duolingo. The CEO, sort of was very kind of boasting about, and I'm replacing all of my staff and artists or whatever with AI. And people like, what the hell are you doing? You're stupid or something. And it was a big backlash. So you're right. I mean, I think there's, for me, the way I see AI, it's not really about replacing jobs, but job realignment. It's really about, skills realignment, job realignment, which of course will involve basically not needing to hire that many people, which, the reason why I think, there's this rise of, I like to describe it as business gurus that basically tell people, well, the only option for you is to become an entrepreneur. But that's also not really the silver lining either, because not anyone can be an entrepreneur, right? It's like people think that it's easy. It's not easy at all.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in our politics, what we've seen is divisions deepening, the divisions between rich and poor, haves and have-nots, the certain rural areas and certain cities. So in the US, it's been between the Midwest and central areas and the coasts. Coastal prosperity. So, but that's a generalization. But I mean, we've seen it in the UK between north and south. So we've seen these divisions increase and become quite worrying and lead to not just conflicts of interest, but sometimes actual conflicts. But I think what AI threatens to do, which I think you were alluding to, is it threatens to make a division between the ordinary worker who's capable at his or her job and dedicated and willing to do it, and the very skilled worker who will then be able to use AI to displace the work of the ordinary worker. So that is a pretty brutal and worrying vision of the future, that you've got it very much more divisive amongst the workforce, that the very able keep their jobs and get paid more, and the less able get paid less or become unemployed.
Yeah.
And so whereas we used to think, well, okay, yeah, the more able get more senior, and the less able there's always work for them. It may become much more brutal and painful for those who are capable of doing their job and not especially good at it.
Hence, I think the government here should do what I know Finland did it, and I know other European countries are doing the same, where they're offering free AI courses to their citizens. Basically, they want every person in their country to be able to understand the basics of AI, but also understanding how do you apply AI within your job, or whatever job that is. And again, I'm pretty surprised that we don't have that here. It's like, they're paid courses, but that's not something that people should pay for. I mean, I think the Finnish one is Helsinki University that led the project. And I thought to myself, we've got the Oxfords and the Cambridges of this world in this country. Why aren't they doing something like that? Why aren't they getting the funds to do something like that? And here we are. I mean, there's nothing in the UK, not as of yet, but the Finns, they did it. I think they did it 3 or 4 years ago. They launched this thing. So they're already well ahead, thinking ahead, saying, hey, look, the AI wave is coming. Well, those of us involved in AI, I've been warning about this for since 2014, actually. But so those involved, they could see this coming. So the fact that the Finns and I think the Swedes as well, they saw this coming well in advance, and they say, okay, hey, citizens, we need to start getting ready for this wave. Otherwise, we're all going to be in trouble. So
Yes.
I'm just, again, very surprised that the UK, just despite the fact that we were one of the leading forces in the AI world, and the government yet again, and surprisingly, universities apparently didn't see this coming. I mean, I'm pretty flabbergasted by that, to be honest.
I know we're better on rhetoric than we are on action. And
Yes. Yes.
Ever since David Cameron, whose background was public relations, ever since his prime ministership, and even Tony Blair's the same. They've been fantastic at making good announcements and spin and presenting things well, but not particularly effective at making things happen. I mean, the equivalent to put it in, to use a metaphor, it's as if the whole country's language is changing. So what do you do when the language in the country changes? Do you send people on free courses to learn the new language? Or do you say, tough guys, most of you won't know the new language, and some of you will go on courses and learn it? But it seems to me that's the metaphor for what's happening, and some countries are doing, as you say, doing the right thing, saying new language needs to be learnt by everyone and pretty fast.
Yeah. Which again, going back to the Vassal State situation, which is definitely it's horrible. Because obviously, I mean, it's getting worse now, especially with the new deal that I mentioned earlier, the AI deal. But for the listeners, because we have got, as I said earlier, that we have listeners outside the UK, what other countries are vassal states? I mean, firstly, are there any, is the UK the worst case scenario, or are they even worse than the UK?
Well, a very good question, Tim. I looked at this because I thought surely it's worse for Canada and Mexico because
Yes.
they are closer and they are obviously much more sort of geographically dependent on the US. And I found that we're in a much worse position than them in a number of ways. First of all, the UK position is that we've got so much investment from the US in our country that we are the biggest overseas location for US investment or purchase of companies, really, in the world. More so than Canada or Mexico. So even though we're a small island 2,000 miles away, 4,000 on the other side, they've invested far more here. So they've got a real interest in making sure that the climate here remains hospitable. Well,
sorry, is that over time? Like so they maximize the investment in the UK over time, or more in the recent years?
It's the total stock of investment that they have in different countries.
Right.
American corporations own significantly more in the UK than they do in Canada or any other country. And yes, it's particularly been in recent years, particularly not so much the last 10 years, a little bit more than that, since the financial crash, since 2009. That was the point at which the US ownership of UK companies really accelerated. But in the case of Mexico and Canada, the relationship is so different that it's not quite the same sort of vassaldom. It's a partnership where those countries have something to offer and gain in a way that we don't. So Mexico is, relatively speaking, quite a poor country, and certainly until the recent changes that Trump has introduced, it has benefited from a lot of remittance payments from Mexicans working in California and in the US and sending money home. It's benefited in the sense that it's quite a lot of, because it's geographically so close and has got cheaper labor, quite a lot of US corporations have placed their manufacturing plants in Mexico, and Mexico's gained from that. And in a way that the Americans wouldn't do that in the UK. It's too far away and labor's not cheap enough. And Canada has gained, although clearly there's been something of a falling out, until recently, it's gained very much by being a natural resources supplier. I mean, not just oil, but many other minerals and fertilizers as well, from potash mines. It's and other raw basic things like wheat and timber. It's been a huge supplier to the US, and it's been able, with a small population, to retain its wealth on a per capita basis. So it's not been taken over and impoverished in the same way. And of course, it hasn't had the same level of capture of people and treasure as the UK has, because many Canadians can work successfully either in competition with US companies or for US companies, but not having to relocate. So the Canadian and the Mexican experiences, although they, in terms of social media and big tech, they've been colonized, they haven't suffered in the same way as the UK has. And thinking of Europe, that's again quite different, because the Germans and the French have been very resistant to too much takeover. So, and the Spanish and Italians even more so. So those are the four biggest European countries outside the UK. So those four countries have been resistant to selling off their assets, and they've been more willing to, much more willing to develop their own competing industries.
Since the Americans hate them, they hate the Europeans because of that, it seems.
That it doesn't lead. It's natural for a colonizing power to like much more those who welcome or tolerate them. And of course, in an earlier era, that was one of the reasons that the British liked some countries more than others, because they were more willing to fit in with the British way of doing things and the British element of control and extraction of economic wealth. But I looked at the number of people in the UK and in Germany and France and Italy and Spain who work for US corporations. And in Italy and Spain, it was typically 200,000, I'm rounding, of their population working for US corporations. So still quite a few, but not in populations of sort of 30, 40 million, not unreasonable. And in France and Germany, it was slightly more in Germany than France. It was about 400,000 or 500,000 working for US corporations, whereas in the UK it was about 2 million. So out of our 30 million workforce, about 1 in 15 is working for a US corporation. Now, I'm including in that working for Amazon Flex, working for Uber, because people who are working for these companies are essentially being paid by an American corporation, even if they're technically self-employed, and they could just as well be taking their income in dollars, and their fate, whether they remain employed, is being decided in the US. So I think it's reasonable to count those as American employees. But even if you don't include those, even the official figures give the figure as about 1.2, 1.3 million UK workers working, so far more than in France and Germany, working for US corporations. And I think that matters. Not that it's a bad thing to be an employee of an American corporation, but taken together, it means that we're so dependent on US companies for our welfare. Just for example, should something bad happen to the US economy, a lot of those people might be more expected to lose their jobs than others. So
that's what I was actually about to ask, because if we have this level of dependency, just as a quick aside, I think we could add this number because Deliveroo recently has been acquired by DoorDash. So quite a lot of their employees and their delivery workers basically now going to be part of the American system as well. But as
Absolutely.
we spoke at the beginning, that if the stock market is so dependent on this AI bubble, because I've seen a few other economists in America, especially, that were saying that from their point of view, everything in the US is in a recession right now, and the only thing that is keeping them afloat is this AI bubble. But if the bubble pops, and and then effectively the American economy goes down, it will absolutely drag us down with it, big time. I mean, more than any, I think the whole world will suffer, but I think the UK specifically, based on everything that you said, it seems that we're going to be really hit hard, won't we?
Yes, I mean, if you're a corporation and you're under huge financial pressure and you're a worldwide corporation, what you will naturally do in a crisis is defend the jobs of the people at headquarters. They're the ones making decisions. They're the ones that socially. They're the ones who they're the kind of the last stand. And the ones who will lose their jobs will be those working in the plants and offices in more remote places.
As usual, yeah.
And a corollary of that is what I've called in the book hometown advantage. It's a terrific benefit if you're a city or a town where a big corporation is based. So if you're the place on the West Coast where Nike are based, the council get a lot of tax from that company. They get a lot of support. You're more likely, if you're going to build a gym and donate it to the community, you'll do it in your headquarters. And very often as well, as in the case of, for example, Dow Chemical in Midland, it's not only that the company will make donations locally, but the owners of the company, the Dow family, live in that town. So if they're setting up if they want to donate for a new music concert hall or a sports center with tennis courts or apprenticeships, a free an educational scheme, they'll do it in their hometown. It's near to them. It's where they get appreciated. So this is what we've lost from some of these takeovers. So Cadbury, for example, used to be very generous in Bourneville, just outside a suburb of Birmingham. They used to be very generous in creating facilities that everyone in Birmingham and beyond would use. And since the takeover, of course, they've stopped spending that money on the local community. So the hometown advantage is a really big thing that many American cities across the whole of the US benefit from, and at the expense of other cities across the world who tend not to have their headquarters there. And we know it when you visit the US, a town will often say, we're the proud headquarters of such and such a company.
Yes. Yeah.
They've been very effective at making sure that not all companies are based in California and Chicago and New York, but that there are right across the US, there are headquarters of significant companies benefiting the local community. So it's a big deal. But you talked about DoorDash taking over Deliveroo, and that's absolutely right. And that's an absolutely typical takeover where DoorDash were always the big player in this market worldwide, and they didn't need to start building up a business here because they knew they could take one over when they wanted to, and they'll get the economies of scale of using the same software that they've developed in the US, using that in the UK to optimize operations. And it's a big advantage for a large economy when it's, particularly in a digital age, when it's working in other countries, because it can use the same infrastructure. So if you think of something like Facebook, when they expand into a new country, or eBay, they hardly need to develop anything new. They just sort of change the language, change the currency, and the principles, the cogs underneath, the hidden machinery, is the same. Compare that with a local competitor trying to compete with eBay in a particular country, and they've got huge startup costs and running costs and keeping the software going and the marketing. So this is a way in which US corporations, particularly tech ones, have an advantage that's very hard for local companies to compete with. It ties up with one of the things that I noticed when I was studying the US corporations and how they operate in the UK, that they've become very brilliant and effective at owning what you might call the pipes and the bridges of the economy, the bits of the economy that we have to trade through. So, I mean, Airbnb is a classic bridge. If you want to rent a cottage to stay at in Wales, you'll probably be renting it from someone who lives in, I don't know, Herefordshire or London or Wales, and you will be renting it probably through Airbnb, and you will therefore be paying a royalty. Effectively, it's about 8%, of what 8% of what you pay doesn't go to the cottage owner, it goes to the middleman or middle platform. And that platform is taking this royalty time after time. In Airbnb's case, it's even better than that because they get the money up front when you book it, and they don't pay it to the property owner until you've left and said you're satisfied. But that's a particularly virtuous, advantageous part of Airbnb's business model. But the main thing is they're a bridge over which you must cross once they're established. But that goes for all sorts of other businesses. I've mentioned eBay, but also Amazon. 40% of their turnover, or more than 40%, is not Amazon stuff coming out of Amazon warehouses. It's Amazon being the platform across which British people sell things to other British people, and Amazon takes a royalty in the process and may not even, and usually doesn't even see the goods. Those are shipped direct from the supplier to the consumer, but the consumer's paying through Amazon and paying Amazon for the pleasure of it. And so that ownership of the platforms is a fantastic way to take a royalty on a whole economy, which applies to the UK. And we've happily surrendered that. And it applies across the world. And it's not just about the platforms for doing the trading. It's also the payment systems. Yeah. The death of cash, which we're witnessing now. Cash, I think, in its final throes. There are many places you go now where cash is not acceptable, and you can see reasons why they want that. The government wants it because it's better for accounts. The company wants it because they can genuinely say to would-be thieves, "There's no cash on the premises." The managers of the business want it because there's no risk of the staff putting a £20 note in their pocket and taking it home. There's no risk of theft. And it makes the whole thing more traceable and analytical. So you can see why people would want it. But in effect, that means that the payments are made through Visa card, MasterCard, Google Pay, Apple Pay. And these are
all American.
These are all pipes that the money goes down and it doesn't arrive intact. It's missing 2 or 3%, sometimes 5%, but it's missing sometimes less, sometimes just 1%. But something is being taken by the pipe that the money goes down. And again, it's a royalty on the whole of the British economy, which is being taken by American multinationals, and without the British government caring much about it. And then they're not worrying enough about how much tax these companies are paying, and they're not worrying enough about how it's controlled. One example is in many countries, if you pay cash, you can get a discount. But the British, under pressure, made it illegal for shopkeepers to give a discount for cash. So you can't. Of course, they will do occasionally, but not the big shops. So whereas it is much cheaper to handle cash, and shops might generally prefer it if offered. So it's an example where the British government have worked in cahoots with US multinationals in a way that disadvantages the British consumer and very much lines the pocket of the US multinational.
Wow. And I'm just thinking to myself, well, how on earth then would we be able to join the EU or rejoin the EU if we have this level of dependency with the US? Because obviously I can't see the Europeans allowing it to happen. Because as you said, this had happened before Brexit, right? And so, which means we could still do more, we could still sell off our country to some extent whilst being part of the EU. But I'm just wondering, because now we effectively crossed the line here that, no EU country would do. Would we be able to rejoin the EU in our current state as a vassal state, as it were?
Yeah, I still think we could if we really wanted to, if we identified the issues. This issue of money, of payment systems is a battle that the Germans and the French are fighting. They've got the same challenge. Both countries take many more shops take cash than we do. But cash is only one aspect of your big question of whether we could join the EU. I think the Americans had mixed feelings about whether we left or not, just looking at the American interests. On one level, once we left the EU, we became more dependent on them for trade and for all sorts of things. And Britain became a place where they could do business without so many any EU regulations. But on the other hand, Britain was a very effective gateway into Europe. So actually, for some US companies, it's been a nuisance that the UK is no longer a gateway into Europe. I mean, we've been a very useful idiot in a way for the Americans, because we've acted, perhaps mostly unawares, as a gateway for the Americans to get their businesses and indeed also their political opinions, their policies into Europe. But we've also been a gateway for the Americans to get their businesses and their opinions into the Commonwealth or the former colonies.
Yes.
So when old established companies are taken over, recently De La Rue is just the banknote printer is just being taken over by US corporation, as I understand it. When these old companies are taken over, it gives American corporations a route into the former colonies, into essentially the Commonwealth countries, and that's been a great trading advantage to them. And we, as I say, we've been useful idiots, supplying them this access, and in a way that explains why the Americans have been so gracious and to the extent they have, and publicly they're often very kind about the British, but kind while exploiting the situation. So I think we've been very helpful to them, and actually we continue to be so. I mean, we've still got a seat on the Security Council. The British still have a network of embassies that is probably significantly greater than their economic position would justify. But those embassies often work to help the Americans as well as the British. So we work as junior partners, maybe vassals, in international affairs as well.
Wow. I mean, it's great work. I mean, I haven't finished reading the book yet, but so far, I mean, it's fantastic work. But I have to say, it's depressing.
Well, that disappoints me. I'm sorry about that.
It's not your fault. That's I mean, you simply revealed the truth, because I mean, there's so much more as well. Because even in terms of influence, I mean, I saw this report. I can't remember the name of the organization. I know. The guys behind Democracy for Sale, they wrote that report about how the Tony Blair Institute is obviously they've received a huge fund from Larry Ellison, obviously the founder of Oracle. Was it $250 million? And basically Tony Blair now suddenly became the biggest advocate of AI out of nothing or nowhere. Well, we can see why. And apparently he's the one who's influencing the current government to go down the route that we just talked about as well. So basically, there's like, even since you released your book, I mean, there's like more web of this craziness emerged ever since, and it just continues, which to me it's mind-boggling and frankly sad to see, as I said. Which brings back, I suppose, to the last point before we finish is the future. I mean, we just sort of talked about potentially rejoining the EU, but going back to the bubble, I think, because obviously. Now that we have that level of dependency, and again, people think that, okay, becoming an entrepreneur is the solution, which I don't say it is. But what is the solution? Like, let's say, let's assume, from the economics perspective, that the bubble will explode. I mean, I believe it will. I mean, as you saw my conversation with Jeffrey Funk, he strongly believes it will. It's because it's just unsustainable anymore. The amount of money that's been spent without any ROI. Especially for the AI companies. So what is the future for people, especially young people who always ask me, Tim, we don't know what we want to do with our lives. And, I always like to ask this question in terms of, your background, because as you said, your whole journey started by accident. But I think it's dangerous for people to kind of rely on accidents. I mean, they need to be strategic about it. But your journey, kind of like similar to my journey from a completely different direction. It's like you didn't necessarily start as an entrepreneur, but you kind of explored multiple opportunities that eventually helped you to kind of get to where you were today. So as a finisher, based on your journey, what is your advice for people now who are worried about the financial crash and, them losing money, losing their jobs? What would be your advice to them, apart from the fact, okay, learn how to use AI, figure out how to use AI for your job, but that alone is not enough. What's the way forward for people?
Well, you're right. Unfortunately, it's a depressing picture I've painted, but I think I've painted a realistic picture. I think what I've done is I've pulled together what's really happening and said, guys, wake up and smell the coffee. Preferably British.
That's what I try to do with this podcast as well. Wake up and smell the coffee or tea. Drink British tea. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I've tried to. So that in a sense has made it a bit of a discouraging topic. But I think we need to do four things nationally, and then I'll come on to your question about how young people should react. I mean, nationally, we need to start by measuring more. It's an absolute travesty and shameful that to get these numbers, I had to use basically two big sources of data from the US, and that the British haven't responded in any way by improving their data. And much of their data, which they do have, at one stage they said, "Oh, we're relying on Standard and Poor's, so an American rating agency, to give me some of their data." So we need to measure more, and we really should know how much of the UK economy, and in detail, how much of each sector is owned by the US, and how many people it employs, how much tax it pays, and how much it doesn't pay. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we should tax properly. We should make sure that, that is one power that is still with us if we're willing to exercise it, to make sure that corporations really pay 25% of their profits instead of 10% or 0. And we're in a difficult position there because we own so many of the tax havens. Out of being major tax havens, we control about 10 of them. And so that's a problem, but the British need to overcome that. They need to get real with their tax havens and say, or ignore the tax havens and just say, we're not going to allow transfer pricing for when you work out your profits, or we're going to have a proper digital services tax, or both. So we need to measure more. We need to tax more. We need to stop the takeovers. It's not other countries do it. It's not unreasonable to say that a company like BP or Shell can't be taken over, and that ownership needs to stay 51% British. That happens in some sectors, not many, and in most countries. In India, for example, insists on all its big corporations being 51% or more owned by Indians, as I understand it, or Indian institutions. So we need to stop the takeovers, which is really selling off what's left of the family silver. And we probably need to be closer to the Europeans, whether that's rejoining the EU or just having much more interaction and working together with them. Personally, I'd rejoin, but even just work closer with them. So I think that's what we need to do. But for an individual, I think that for young people, individuals, it's very difficult. I think human capital, even in the face of AI, is the important thing, and having education. I think that's the thing, as you say, learning how to use AI as part of it. But education, there are many other skills. Practical skills are useful. So I think we need to. I've got 4 boys, and I'm very. Whenever they want to do another, they're in their 20s or early 30s. Whenever they want to do a course or anything like that, I'm totally supportive. Sometimes financially, and they are willing to forego income in order to learn more, to learn more skills. 3 of them, even at that later age, are currently in the education system in one form or another, and I think that's wise. So it's one of the things I think the government is right to do, to have more, to encourage more people to go to university and more people to do further courses. And I think even for a dominant state like America, I think an educated workforce is valuable to them. So even if we can't change the geopolitics of what I've outlined, we make ourselves more valuable to ourselves and to other employers from other countries if we have more skills. So I think education is the future. This is probably the one thing where I agree with Tony Blair about when he said education, education, education. But just picking up on your point about the Blair Institute, I think one of our problems as well is that domination of our society has started to include our think tanks.
Yes.
So the American think tanks that operate in London have become more influential, and the more neutral think tanks have become more pro-American because that they know that's where they're getting their funding. These huge entrepreneurs, you gave the example of Larry Ellison, they're capable of changing a think tank's orientation and program of work by who they choose to fund.
And that's something that needs to be regulated as well, because we have no idea. We have a lot of dodgy, as you said, think tanks, including those that actually pushed for Brexit and Liz Truss. They're the same people behind Project 2025 in the US. Nobody knows where the money's coming from, who they are. They're not regulated. They've got a free pass to do whatever the hell they want. And I think that's something that absolutely needs to be regulated as well. Because I'm genuinely disappointed with Tony Blair Institute, because they actually started doing the right stuff. They were working on good projects and stuff. But the report that I highlight, I'll put it in the description. I think that could probably be a whole separate episode, because there's so much in there. Again, it's like similar to your book. There's so many networks involved behind the scenes. Even including African nations as well that have got mixed up in all of this. And it's bad picture. It's not a good picture at all.
Some sectors are notoriously subject to lobbying, and defense, energy, nuclear, oil. These are areas where the big decisions are made by where you can place a refinery, whether you spend more money on, whether you invest in new nuclear, what your attitude to taxing of oil consumption is. These big decisions are made by central government, and so they're very much the areas where think tanks and lobbyists can and do have a huge influence. And the government have made it public, forced the Scottish government and the London government have made it a requirement that lobbyists are more declared than they used to be in the past. But there are a lot of lobbies that are less apparent, such as think tanks, and many of the lobbyists, it's declared who they are, but not what they're doing. They're one knows that they're pretty effective. And one of the lessons, Tim, that I've learned about the Americans is that not only are they personally often and usually very nice, and like you, I've got American relatives, but they're very effective. They're very focused on efficiency. And the slogan that was coined, I think, by a chap from Zwingli was when he said, "The business of America is business," is absolutely right. They are efficient. They work very hard. They work harder than the Brits in terms of the average number of hours. They take fewer holidays. They work longer. I'm not being defeatist about that, but I'm saying we should show respect and recognise that although some of their success is based on lobbying and an unfair advantage, some of it is based on hard work and efficiency. And I've got a whole chapter on it's kind of the American way and respecting the way they do things. So I think it's important to respect them and learn from them, and definitely not to be rubbishing them.
Well, that's as I was about to say, that your book is not really about anti-America. It's simply, it's more like America. They're just playing the game, right? It's like I highlighted, I think one of the episodes as well, because of my previous years in sports. It's like sometimes, you follow the rules in sports, but for whatever reason, if the referee is not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and the other players are playing dirty, you've got to play dirty, whether you like it or not. It's just the nature of the game. And the Americans are absolutely brilliant at that. I mean, you don't build the strongest economy in the world if you're not very good at it. So I think, what your book highlights is it's not anti-America, but rather that it's the rest of the world that need to catch up, because the Americans are absolutely going to just chew you up. And why not? If they know how to do it, they'll do it. But I think the onus is on us, our countries, like the listeners, for us to learn how do we do what the Americans are doing, so that then we can actually then stand up, not against them, to say, well, actually, hey, calm down. We're not going to take over everything. Let's negotiate. You play the game like the Americans, basically, which is the reason why we're having this conversation. And that's why you booked us really well. I think that it's not anti-American or sort of America bashing, but it's really about opening the eyes of people that, hey, look, this is how you do business. So if you want to keep up, you better start keeping up, or you sell off. And selling off is not a good idea.
Absolutely. I mean, we should demand better of our politicians and policymakers. I mean, they let us down so badly, and we're allowing them to continue doing that. We are, as my friend once pointed out in a very succinct phrase, we are poorly led, and we need to recognise that and complain about that, and make sure that we to the extent we can, that we select better leaders, and ideally people who've been in the real world. We should give more priority to people who've been in business and who've had to meet payroll, and who've had to think about the risks that a business undergoes, and who've actually had to pay tax at scale. That's my.
I agree, but I would also caution people, because you have people like Richard Tice or Farage or even Donald Trump that they say, hey, they're very good with business. I'm like, actually, no, you're not. You inherited your business. I mean, I know what you mean is people who actually built businesses from the ground up, not inherited. I mean, that's a completely different ball game. So, yes. And I think, you're right. I mean, I think. I guess it's entrepreneurship, because it kind of takes a different kind of mindset to be an entrepreneur. Like, you have to be very creative, and you have to be a realist, and you basically don't just give things away. You fight for everything, basically, because that's how you survive.
But I don't think it's just capitalist businesses that we should be respecting. We should respect people who've built up social enterprises. Those still require paying the bills. They still require positioning commercially. And they still require thinking about needs, satisfying people's needs. So I think social entrepreneurs equally should be seen as people who can give useful, really strong and important opinions on how we run the country. Because they've been there and they've experienced the challenge of running an enterprise, even if its main objective is not to make money.
Yeah, and they need to get funded. I mean, I ran a social enterprise years and years ago before David Cameron came in and decided to kill all the funds, and in the name of so-called big society, aka slave labor. It was horrendous. I mean, I think even till this day, I think social enterprises are not being funded enough. But you're right. I mean, it's the same sort of. I mean, I'm trying to build. At the time of the recording, I already announced that I'm trying to build a non-for-profit AI organization called IQ. Basically taking out all the R&D work that we're doing with my company into that, because I feel like in the UK, going back to the point that we talked about, that it's not investment is just going to be from the Americans or British companies that want to sell us off to somebody. But I feel that we reached a point where AI now, we need to counterbalance the commercial AI, which is not really in the public interest anymore, as we're seeing with the hallucination problem, we're seeing with the increased psychosis and all of the horrible things that I talk a lot about as a way, again, to increase awareness. So I'm building this non-for-profit, and there are more of companies like that emerging in Europe, and they're getting a lot of funds. In the UK, they're not. And I think that's a problem again. So you're right. I mean, that's something that we need to bring people like that into power. Not me. I'm not interested. Are you interested by any chance? Are you going to be an MP one day?
No, I'm too old. I'm 65, but I think everyone should be interested in the public debate and the public forum and what happens to our collective future as well as our individual future. And so I'm very much following. I'm not party political, but I'm very much following politics, and I'd like I think many other people, I'd like to have an influence for the better. And that's what I hope the book will do. And indeed, I'm active in a think tank called the Intergenerational Foundation, which is campaigning for the interests of younger generations, which are so often neglected, and even their interests are compromised by the desires of the older generation. So as a baby boomer, I feel I've been dealt a hand that's been too generous, and we as a group have not done what we should have done in terms of either how we've treated the planet, or how we've elected politicians that constantly pander to our interests, often at the expense of younger people. So I'm not in politics as such. I think it matters what happens with our politics and with public policy.
Well, it's really, it needs to be part of your business planning. Even I tell people these days that, because you see that on LinkedIn, people complain sometimes that when I get somewhat political, but I say, well, I'm not political. I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm also, I don't support any party, but politics now is impacting our lives in such a way that unless you understand what's going on, you will be, a silly entrepreneur like some of the American entrepreneurs that felt that voting for Trump to bring tariffs is a good idea, which of course is not for their business. It literally killed their businesses. Because I see a lot of reports like that business owners voted for Trump because they were convinced that tariffs is a good idea, which is like, how could you not know that as a business owner? And I think this is the key point, as you said, that, I think understanding politics. And I made this warning, I think in August 2024, about how politics is going to be impacting AI, and it's going to create an AI dystopia, not a utopia. And at the time, I had a bit of pushback, people on YouTube and letting this out, Tim, you're being hyperbolic. And I'm like, well, look at it. And now they're like, Tim, yeah, you were right. Saying, I'm like, yes. I mean, basic politics, you don't have to be an expert, but you just need to understand what's going on, because we live in a world right now, especially as your book highlighted. I mean, politics now is impacting every single thing. Maybe that's the first time. I mean, certainly in my life, in my lifetime, I don't remember politics having had that major influence on tech, for example. But now it does. It's everywhere. So you've got to understand what's going on with politics, and get involved in the sense that you talk to your MPs. Like, as you said, if what's happening in the UK is unacceptable. So you vote for these people. You go there, tell them, hey, I don't want my country to be sold off this way. I think that's really important. So here to that, all I have to say is thank you for your book. I mean, we need more people like you. And sometimes I don't attack, but I criticize some baby boomers that they don't think like you do. They think that they had to work hard for everything that they have, and I feel that they attack young people in a pretty despicable manner, in my opinion. So what you just said about the work that you do is it's quite refreshing. So is there anything else? I mean, where can people find you online if they want to talk to you or if they want to ask you questions and things like that?
Well, I'm easy to find online, even my phone number. It's all very public. And I
wouldn't do that.
I'm always on discussions. My email is angus@if.org.uk or angus@dulwich.co.uk, and always keen to have discussions and offer whatever support I can to anyone. But the book Vassal State: How America Runs Britain is mostly relevant to this discussion. And although one or two bits of it have been are not fully up to date because it was published 18 months ago, it's all still relevant, and nothing in it is wrong. There was one typo that's been corrected in the paperback edition. And
are you working on any other books? Is there anything in the pipeline?
Well, I'm trying to study the extent to which Britain is solvent. I'm wondering if we are basically a bankrupt state. So I'm kind of reading about looking at that. Everyone assumes we're solvent because we've been there so long, and we regard paying. We always think we'll pay our debts, but our debts are greater than most people assume. So I'm looking at that. Yeah. It's slightly depressing topic again, but it's always good to get things right and to know what the facts are.
Well, it's not depressing for the sake of it. Like you said earlier, it's about opening people's eyes, because at the end of the day, if you want to solve a problem, you need to be honest about the problem and how bad the problem is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But Angus, again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This is a great discussion, and I think we have to come back to all of these topics. I think every topic probably needs a whole episode because that's the world that we live in today. It's ridiculously complex. But thank you so much for your time.
All the
your
best.
work.
All the best with the IQ project. Sounds brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, my friends, this is it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, before I go away, if you are on YouTube, please make sure that you hit the subscribe button below. It really makes a massive difference for the growth of our channel. And if you're following us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you need to give us a star review. Apparently, your following means nothing unless you give us a star review. Don't ask me why, but give us whatever star review that you think is fair. And if you're not following us, what are you doing? Come on, man. It doesn't cost you anything. It really makes a big difference. I really, really appreciate your support. But also, if you've got cash to spare, consider to become a founding member. We are an independent medium. We're not reliant on any kind of company that gets money from Russian oligarchs or any kind of weird sponsorships or anything like that. All of the companies that work with us are genuine companies that I know and I like. But ultimately, it's the members, you guys, our subscribers, our followers, our founding members, or those of you who actually just donated us like $1 here, a couple of bucks there, $5 there. All of that makes a big difference. This is what makes us truly independent. We're not chasing clickbait because we don't want clickbait. We want facts. We want the truth. We want something that we can all aspire to and something that truly make us at least work harder to make the world a better place. Not just talk about it, but actually make it happen. And of course, it supports all of our campaigns as well. So my friends, thank you so much. Much love. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.